Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Inter-American Dialogue. Thank you very much for joining us for what I'm sure will be an extremely interesting discussion. Very timely and important topic, Latin America's digital economy and trends in international taxation. Like the rest of the world, Latin America in the Caribbean are becoming digitized very, very quickly, which poses a host of new questions and important challenges for governments. There's a very fierce debate underway in the region about whether and how to tax businesses with a substantial digital footprint but no physical presence in a given country. New business models have disrupted entire industries and created what many nations see as a mismatch between taxation and value creation for digital activities. Digital tax proposals in the region are being studied and widely discussed. Already, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and Colombia have proposed or implemented reforms to tax the digital economy, either directly or indirectly. These uncoordinated efforts, while important, create some uncertainty. The challenge is to avoid inconsistent or non-neutral taxation across firms and across countries. Calls for international consensus by the OECD are an important step, but certainly there is a long way still to go. Fortunately, today we have three leading experts and superb speakers to shed some light on this very complicated and critical problem. Each of the speakers will open up with about 10 minutes of remarks, and then we will invite and encourage your participation with any comments and questions. Let me introduce them very briefly in the order in which they will speak. We first have Grace Perez Navarro, who is the Deputy Director of the OECD Center for Tax Policy and Administration. She plays a key role in the base erosion and profit shifting project, improving international tax cooperation, tackling illicit financial flows, promoting better tax policies, and engaging countries in OECD tax work. Welcome, Grace. It's great to have you. Next, we'll hear from Luis Alberto Rodriguez, who's the Deputy Minister of Finance and Public Credit of Colombia. He holds a master's degree in economic policy from Columbia University and previously studied economics at the Universidad Nacional in Colombia, Universidad de Buenos Aires, and the École d'Economies de Toulouse. He is, when he was assumed his post in August of last year, he became the youngest Deputy Minister of Finance in the history of Colombia. So, Luis Alberto, nice to have you with us. Then we will turn to Ubaldo González de Frutos, who is a lead specialist on tax administration at the Inter-American Development Bank. He promotes an agenda for the digitalization of tax administrations in Latin America and the Caribbean. Before joining the bank, Mr. González de Frutos was senior advisor at the OECD's Center for Tax Policy and Administration. Finally, we'll hear from Karim Lesina, who was appointed Senior Vice President, International External Regulatory Affairs, AT&T Services in last June. He previously held the position of Vice President at AT&T, covering international external affairs for the European Union, the Caribbean, Central America, and Latin America regions, and was in charge of transatlantic relations. In this role, he led AT&T's advocacy in those regions. So it's hard to imagine having four better prepared, qualified, equipped people to share their perspectives on this very important issue. Before I turn it over to Grace to get us started, I want to give special recognition to my dialogue colleagues who have worked on this event. Eric Brand is our director of our corporate program. He's standing there in the back. He publishes our daily Latin American Advisor. And just to let you know, on March 27th, we had a special edition of the edition of the Advisor really was devoted to this question, where we got different perspectives to to share their thoughts on this issue. Also want to thank Denise Yanovich, who is the Director of External Relations, and a special thanks to Leonie Rawls, who has really put in a lot of hard work in making this event possible. So we appreciate her very valuable contribution. Thanks, Leonie. With that, thank you again, and I'll turn it over to Grace to get us started. Grace?
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I will try very hard to speak quickly because it's very hard to cover this topic in 10 minutes, but I'll do my best. You mentioned the fact that I'm very involved in the base erosion profit shifting project. That is essentially the basis upon which we are carrying out this work on digitalization. Action 1 of the 15-point action plan of the base erosion profit shifting project was focused on this whole issue of the tax challenges arising from the digitalization of the economy. Why? Because people around the world were seeing that companies could engage very significantly in the economic life of another, companies could engage in the economic life of another country very substantially, earn substantial profits, but still not be taxed there because they didn't have a physical presence or otherwise meet the requirements to be able to be taxed there. And that was, it became a highly political issue because people on Main Street were seeing the very large multinational companies as a result in large part of the efforts of NGOs and the media to call attention to this issue. They were showing that multinationals were not paying substantial amounts of tax in the places in which they were operating. And so this was kind of the core impetus for the BEPS project, if you will, and that because it was so publicly known, this became a very political issue as well, and so that's how it got into the whole G20 process. So for those of you who have followed the BEPS project, and many of you I realize may have not, we delivered a package of measures to address the various challenges that countries face in trying to ensure that they can control tax avoidance by multinationals. And on Action 1, so the tax challenges of the digitalization of the economy, I have to say that, you know, in looking back, we made some great progress on the VAT side, and we can talk about that later. But on the direct income tax side, which is really where most of the attention has been focused, we basically said, one, you cannot ring fence the digital economy because the whole economy is becoming highly digitalized. And so if we were to just look at the usual suspects in the tech world, in 5 years' time, we would have to be changing the rules because every company, automotive companies, airlines, et cetera, they're all becoming increasingly digitalized. And we need rules that will withstand the test of time. And so we said you can't ring fence it. We also said, well, we have all these other measures in transfer pricing and other areas that will largely address the concerns that countries have. So let's wait and see until 2020 how these measures play out and how they address the issues that countries were concerned about. At the same time, we're talking about tax avoidance, and so we're talking about base erosion, but there's something larger than that, and that is this fundamental issue that you mentioned, which is do the international tax rules still capture value created by companies when you have this situation where you can make substantial profits without having any physical presence. Those physical presence rules were developed over 100 years ago, and is it time to rethink those? Now, we were not able to get agreement in 2015 on making any changes to those fundamental principles. We did discuss various ways that you could address the issue, withholding taxes, equalization levies, or some kind of significant economic presence test to replace or enhance the permanent establishment rules, which currently require a physical presence. But we did not reach agreement among the countries working on this project at the time, which included not only the OECD 36 countries, but also the G20 countries that are not part of the OECD and all the countries like Colombia, for example, who are in the process of joining the OECD. And so that's where we left it. Let's wait and see how the BEPS measures work. We'll come back in 2020. Well, as you can see, we have not waited till 2020. The political pressure is still there, and the G20 came back to us and said, please, we want at least an interim report in 2018. So we did that last March, and that report showed how all the different business models continued to change from our initial report in 2015 and explored possible ways of trying to look at this issue again. Now, we didn't get consensus then either. We weren't expecting it. And we did have 3 groups of countries at that time. One group that was basically saying, you know what, let's just keep waiting for the BEPS measures and see what happens. We don't really need any changes, and it's too early to assess the BEPS measures, which frankly is true because legislation had to be enacted, treaties had to be changed, etc. Then we had another group of countries that said, well, yes, there is something different here. And, you know, it's the user contribution. It's the fact that when somebody is engaging in social media or buying something online, they are contributing some value to what is happening online. And so we should come up with a targeted measure focused on this user contribution. Then there is another group of countries that says, well, no, there is a problem, but it is not restricted just to this user contribution. And we have to look at this in a broader way. And we need to see, yes, how we can allocate more taxing rights to the market jurisdiction, but on the basis of something we call marketing intangibles. And so they wanted something broader. So that's where we left it. We have, since that time, been working on proposals. You will have seen that we put out a policy note in January and then a public consultation document, which set out 2 pillars of action in this area. The first pillar is focusing on this allocation of taxing rights and the nexus, because currently the nexus is mainly physical presence. And so we need to look at both how you allocate taxing rights and the nexus at the same time. Why? Because you could establish a nexus, but then if there aren't any profits to attribute to that nexus, what have you really done? So we need to look at both of these things. And we have 3 different proposals on the table under this. Then we have a second pillar, which is focused on the broader issues. And if you like, it might be seen as like a backstop to the pillar 1 proposals on allocating taxing rights. And this proposal it can be described as a minimum tax, but you should not interpret that as saying, oh, the OECD is going to set a single tax rate for the world. No. What this is, it's something that would allow countries to essentially tax back the taxing right they have given away either in their tax treaties or domestic legislation when profits are taxed at a very low rate or no rate in another country. And so that is the second pillar. These 2 are not competing proposals, but can be seen as complementary. Now, we had a huge public consultation on this, over 400 people. We got over 200 written comments on this, and we are currently working on trying to narrow and refine first the proposals under the first pillar, looking at, you know, how much of a scope are we going to include in this new taxing right? What would be the parameters, thresholds, et cetera? So we're still looking at all 3 of these proposals, but trying to narrow them. At the same time, on the second pillar, we are also trying to refine that. And we're doing it through a group that we have called the Inclusive Framework on BEPS, Base Erosion and Profit Shifting. We have 129 countries working on this together, including most Latin American countries and Caribbean countries as well. And they all have an equal footing and an equal say in this process. So that is where we are. We are supposed to deliver a final consensus-based solution in 2020. So a big challenge, but also a big opportunity to change the tax rules.
Great. Thank you. Great. Good luck with that.
Thank you. I need more than luck.
Okay, thanks. Luis Alberto.
Michael, thanks for inviting me. I would say that definitely this is an important topic, especially for emerging market. And I would like to to point out like three parts of my opinion in this. The first thing is actually Grace mentioned like, well, this is political trending now, the topic, but actually it's more than that because, and I'm talking about my generation because I'm clearly, and you mentioned my age in the presentation, but actually the discussion in emerging markets, what actually is happening in the market in this kind of in digital economy, and you know pretty well because we are the generation that using deeply all these services and goods, and actually we have like a weird opposition between two trends. So one is that you are very into these kind of services and goods, but on the other hand, you have people that actually thinks the economy in a particular way. Probably the tax appreciation and the expenditure that the people used to have in the previous generation was pretty different to the one that I have, probably. And basically, we think that anything that is related to the state and the government and any expenditure, sometimes in my generation, because I don't because of my job, but actually the people around me all the time is telling me, well, what are you doing with the taxes? Why are you taxing? I was the one who was leading the discussion in the last year about the tax reform, and it was very common. Like, why are you taxing food, for instance? Why are you trying to put VAT to food? And try to extrapolate this to the digital economy. Like, it's even worse, the discussion. Like, why are you trying to not only the NGO discussion of why are these companies that are actually not paying or something like that they try to say sometimes, but also you have the citizens saying, well, why are you trying to tax this kind of thing that are working and you are you became already old people that try to tax everything and become bureaucracy in everything and you are broker more, etc., etc. And so actually is I would say that definitely the first thing is a very hard discussion in emerging markets because you have one part this trend of digital economy, but in the other trend you have a generation and a booming that is they related the relation to the state and the government and to the taxes and everything related to the public sector is weird. So I will say that definitely we have in the first part this strange relation in the emerging markets, and I can feel it at least in Colombia, and I guess it's not that different as I received from some colleagues in the region that actually is not that different in Chile, in Argentina, and other countries. That's the first thing that I would like to say. The second, and I want to acknowledge all the work that OECD has been doing in this topic because it's not hard topic since the political view, but also technical point of view is very high level. I mean, and that's one part of the discussion that actually any discussion that you have about information is difficult to get all the state and the government and all the officials to understand, and probably the decision that you take at the top level is difficult to disseminate it to the rest of the government and all the institutions that you have. So the role that the OECD has been playing there is quite important. Actually, Colombia has been working in the committee, the fiscal committee of arts and these topics, and the tax agency in particular has been very involved in the discussion. And I think in some way our takeaway of this topic is without cooperation is almost impossible. Like you can end it up in a bad equilibrium that actually you have base erosion and profit shifting, and you have the other one that are actually charging more than, and you don't have a neutral tax scheme, and none of them are a cool equilibrium. I mean, we don't want them, and we would like to have definitely something in the middle and that's we have been trying. Colombia passed a tax reform 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and one last year, and actually we got involved in the discussion and we put some effort in VAT and income taxes related to digital economy. But it takes me to the third point that I would like to point out, and that is even if you take decisions, like if you make decisions like we did do in the tax reform, actually when you get in the implementation phase, is hard. And we've realized that, and we have, already experienced in the treatment of the topic, but actually has been very difficult to implement. And we've been receiving feedback from the companies. We've been receiving feedback even from the citizen, and we still are involved in the discussion how to move to 2020, and hopefully taking into account all the discussion, the global discussion that is around, and all the learned lessons that we have from the recent 3 years. Probably we can move forward. But the third thing that I would like to point out is actually if we don't develop all the capability of the tax agencies in the countries, it's impossible to get to wherever the discussion should take us. And even if we decided, I don't know, if you take the smarter people in the world and the most experienced policymakers about the topic, and you take also the citizen, and you take the companies, and you get something perfect, supposedly that you can do. Suppose that you can do that, and if you have that, actually getting from there to the implementation, you need to increase the capability of the agencies in each country. We've seen it in the discussion of not only this topic but other topics in our country. The DIAN, that is the tax agency, still, even you have the top level executive that understand the problem. Probably when you go down to the one that actually is signing the report and going forward the taxes and talking to the companies, probably he understands pretty different the approach, and he thinks that the problem should be equal to a previous generation of economy. So I think to sum up, I will sum up in 3 parts. The first part is definitely we have a generational problem there around, and it's not only politics; it's more than that. Is how we relate it to the state, to the government, to the public affairs, and others. The second part is cooperation, and that's is a main issue in the discussion. Definitely, we need a cooperation in order to solve the problem and to solve it properly. And the OECD has been working a lot on that, and I would like to acknowledge it. And I've been doing it any time that I'm in a table like this. And the third part is we need to increase the capability of the countries, and in particular the tax agencies, because if we solve the two prior topics, actually the delivery is even harder in emerging markets, in developing countries that have actually different problems. Just to mention that there is a different topic, that we just reduced the tax corporate, as the Minister Carrasquilla mentioned it in the morning, and the discussion around that was pretty difficult, and basically because the information related to these topics are hard to communicate.
Thank you very much, Luis Alberto. Very interesting. I'm sure we'll pick up on some of the issues you raised in the discussion. Ubaldo.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I like your approach, so I'm going to use your structure to discuss what the IDB role is in this thing. First of all, the IDB is not a standard setting body. We're a financial institution for development. So the role of the bank is to support countries such as Colombia in their tax policy and tax administration reforms. And as Grace mentioned, most of our member countries are members of the task force on the digital economy as well. Certainly all the non-borrowing countries, the 22 countries that lend money to the other 28, all the non-borrowing countries are members, and of the borrowing members, 65% are also sitting in the task force on the digital economy of the OECD. So our role is not really to help them in that discussion, because they're sufficient to do that. We're more concerned about closing the gap, and this can be a generational thing, the collection gap, the revenue gap that exists between OECD members with a 34% of tax to GDP ratio, 34, compared to Latin American countries where the average is about 16%. So it's a 20-point gap, very significant, and we're concerned that these countries are not going to meet the 2030 agenda if revenue does not increase significantly. So the second point is, how does the digital economy affect particularly developing countries or countries like Latin American countries? Two ideas about that. First of all, the tax structure is very different. In Latin America, we rely more on consumption taxes than in developed economies. So all the revenue lost to consumption that is not being effectively taxed on VAT is a big loss for these countries. If we move to the direct taxes system, there's another different, and that pertains to the importance of corporate income tax in the tax mix of the countries. The OECD has on average a 9.9% of tax revenue comes from the corporate income tax, all right? Well, Colombia, to give an example, is 25%. So it's a huge difference in terms of what corporate income tax means for these countries. Mexico, 22. So there are some countries where corporate income tax is a really main source of revenue. Now, what happens is, first of all, these countries, no country is collecting revenue from digital companies in the corporate tax. These countries certainly are not collecting that. But moreover, the tax base is eroding. And we see that in the transportation sector, very clearly in the hotel industry, where half of the tax base has vanished. And some other sectors like retail is also taking a toll on the digital economy. So this means this problem is hard for these countries. In terms of what we do, well, the OECD is leading the discussions. So we're following that. We're supporting the task force on the digital economy. There is this discussion on the three options that were put forward in February: the marketing intangibles approach, the value creation approach, the user value approach, and the significant economic presence approach. And I think this is the preferred option, the third one, the significant economic presence, which is sort of another form of calling a digital permanent establishment. The group of 24 has presented a formal proposal to endorse this. Colombia is one of the leading countries in that chapter. I think that is the point of view of the region. I'm not aware that any other country would take a different stance, and the reason for that is that this significant economic presence approach is the one that in principle will be capable of giving back some tax base to the market economies like Latin American economies. Now, in the meantime, what the countries are doing, some of them are taking unilateral measures. We've seen, and I think you mentioned in the introduction, the case of Argentina, where there is a equalization tax. Well, Argentina did two things. One, they made explicit the principles of VAT, that Netflix and all these services will be taxed in the place of consumption. And moreover, that was the federal level. Then some provinces, beginning with Cordoba, but I think others have followed suit, they implemented a digital services tax, and one withholding tax of 2% initially, and then moving to 5%. Uruguay did something similar. There is an equalization levy that is collected via withholding in Uruguay, and as we speak, Chile is debating another measure to tax digital businesses. It began sort of a UA style, European Union style digital services tax with a 10% rate. And then along the discussion in Parliament, it was sort of reframed towards a 19% VAT. That's the standard rate of VAT in Chile. But I don't think there has been a solution as of today, so we're following that. Mexico also spoke about a digital services tax or an equalization levy, but I think the new government has committed to give the country a break of 3 years without new taxes, so that's in principle unlikely. These are developments that are occurring in the last year. These things were from mid-2018. And we're saying that we, at the Inter-American Development Bank, we do not advise countries to take unilateral measures. Quite the opposite. If they ask our advice, we ask them to wait until 2020 and see what the final OECD report or inclusive framework report has to say about it, because it doesn't make much sense to take measures for 1 year, which afterwards you may have to undo, and we advise to wait and see. In the meantime, and I'm going to conclude my remarks with this, what we're doing is we are helping countries implement the principles of destination and neutrality in VAT, which means helping countries collect the VAT of digital services, the indirect tax, not the direct, but the indirect tax via either withholding or the measure that was proposed in the 5th Global Forum on VAT last month, which is creating a regime of full responsibility for the platforms, for things like Amazon or eBay, being responsible for collecting the VAT on behalf of the traders that are selling or producing or offering their services through the platform. That doesn't need, the indirect tax is a little bit less complicated because we don't need to build a new architecture. The principles of destination are already shared by the 190 countries that have a VAT in the world, so that's fine. We're just moving to implementation, as Luis was saying. And in terms of that, and I forgot that, but I want to say, I think Latin America has a big opportunity to leapfrog and increase the fiscal space by reducing informality. We have an advantage, an incredible advantage, which is e-invoice. The electronic invoice is very popular in Latin America. It exists in 10 countries, and this is not a situation that you see in other parts of the world. We've got that. It's a great opportunity. We just need to follow through and take all that information and transform it into control, but not control, but rather service. Colombia, that is putting in place the electronic invoice this year, with a little bit of help, a little bit of investment, can give all the traders, all the businesses, their tax positions in the corporate income tax and in VAT with pre-populated returns using the electronic invoice. I think that will be a huge opportunity to reduce the informal sector and help these countries develop and meet the sustainable development goals. That is the agenda of everybody around. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Baldo. Karim.
Okay, so it's difficult to follow three experts like this on talking about taxes. But I wanted, and don't be worried if I start very, very early, but I'm going to respect my 10 minutes. But do you know when the first taxes got levied? long time before we were born, at least me, I'm not so old. I pretend not to be. Taxes exist for more than 6,000 or 7,000 years. Okay, governments, the Greeks, the Egyptians, and I want to go there, the Romans, even if I have an Arabic name, I am half Italian and I'm proudly from Rome. The Romans were using that in order to expand the empire, to invest a lot, to give services, but mostly to raise the army. And one of the reasons why the Roman Empire failed is also because they started raising a little too many taxes, arriving to the 4th century after Christ and almost collapsing. From the whole historical part, we have been raising taxes mostly to pay, it was mostly for war and etc. And they were raising it on all the citizens. Okay, so you will understand why I'm going to the history. When you look at today, and when we talk about digital, what is digital? Who is digital? We are all digital. Who of you is born or when you was at university didn't have a mobile phone? Because I think most of these rooms had mobile phones when they were at university. I didn't. I admit it. Okay, mobile phone didn't exist at my time. But what I'm saying that is we are getting in a shift between people that were used in a certain way to the new generation that came into the world of digital and was watching digital in a totally different way. Who of you is using, and I'm going to use Amazon because some friends are here, who is watching Netflix, who is watching Hulu, even DirecTV Now, I hope you are. But this way of consumption is changing totally the paradigm, and this is one of the challenges we have today because you were rightly saying that we are living with rules of yesterday in a world of today. But this is not only taxation. This is everything. This is normal. We need to modernize a regulation and evolve our regulatory framework constantly. But those regulatory frameworks are based on one main principle. Everybody contributes. I think you were raising a good point about informality. You were raising a good point about the fact that not everybody pays, or how do you define who pays and who doesn't pay? So where I want to go is this. You consume most of your content. We are, you know us as a telco here, and I hope you're all customer of AT&T. And if you're not, you come after and we can work on that, okay? But in Latin America, we are mostly a pay TV distributor with DirecTV, if you don't know the brand, or with Sky in Brazil, plus a wireless operation in Mexico. So what we do is that we distribute content, and people are watching the content in a totally different way that they are watching it before. But we are still regulated as a content distribution with very specific legislation because we are a satellite provider. Others are going to be regulated in a different way because they came after, so the regulatory framework didn't get adapted or needs to get modernized. And a good example is Colombia. They have been trying, and this government has been trying to modernize that framework, and we hope they will be able to do it because it's going to create a level playing field for everybody. But where is the real problem? We talk about finding more resources, right? Because we want taxes to find more resources. I'm Italian. People think all the time how we are going to pay the pensions of my brother-in-law who is working right now, and in 20 years' time, maybe he will not be able to get his pensions because we are not able to fund everything. So what I want to focus is this. We often look at putting taxes on the existing players, growing the taxes, or looking at new way to tax people that are potentially not taxing. But what we often don't look at is what we call the informal world, okay? If you use it in our sector, just to give you an idea of the numbers, we have around 25-27% of what we call pirated content or pirated service. So 25% of the market doesn't pay those taxes. One of my colleagues this morning was telling me you have to push the main messages. Pirates don't pay tax. Okay, but it's something that you'll need to look at to think to it, because if you come to Quito, okay, and we use Quito. I use Quito not because I have nothing against Ecuador, the contrary, I love Ecuador. But it's easier because when you go to Quito, all the buildings are almost at the same level. So if you are able to go at the center and you get in one of the higher buildings, you see the roofs of all the buildings. Why the roof is important? How do you distribute satellite television? You put satellite antennas. In Ecuador, or in general, we put our logo on the satellite antennas. Okay, so if you look at a DirecTV antenna, if you have a DirecTV subscription, you know that we have a DirecTV logo. So you go on the floor of Quito and you look at all the antennas. You have one DirecTV, you have one of our competitor, and most of the time you have one that has no logo on it. And sometimes those are probably illegal. Not everything is illegal, but the reality is that you calculate that. So the numbers that you're looking is around 25%. And, we made a calculation, and I'm getting the numbers so I'm not getting wrong, okay? But just to give you an idea, we made a calculation with a group called Alianza, okay? Alianza contra la Piratería, that just will give you an idea of the numbers. So this kind of piracy in the region where DirecTV has operation represent around $1.4 billion of evaded taxes. $1.4 billion, okay? But it also represents around 50,000 jobs lost. Why I'm insisting on this? We are paying the taxes since the Roman Empire and even before. The citizens. 50,000 of job lost. And we made the calculation to give you an idea that pay TV operations creates around 200 jobs per 100,000 subscribers. Okay, that's an average. Report is public, so it gives you an idea that there is around $6.5 billion in annual losses for pay TV operators and programmers. So not only us, the whole industry. Start thinking to this. I'm giving you numbers, but this is only for our sector. Is it easier to look at this and to try also to tackle this heavily with looking at the informal and to try to get that informal, specifically when we know that a lot of that piracy is not something made pro bono, okay? People makes money out of that. That's a good way to find some of the resources that are missing, okay? And that's a short-term approach in order to really tackle this. And at the same time, because I'm not saying that we should not do something, we are supporting the work that is done by the OECD, and we really believe it's essential to go with an ecosystem approach. Let's call it like this, in our sector, we love talking about the ecosystem. We are part of an ecosystem, okay? We are all together. Ecosystem comes from nature. It doesn't come from digital. In the ecosystems, if one species is much stronger than the other, the whole species will disappear because the species is going to eat all the species that are less important or less strong. So in an ecosystem, we need to be all together and work together to try to find a solution. And I think the work that the OECD is doing is really the essential work. And I really agree with you. We should not start moving with one, I will do this proposal, I will do this proposal, because one is going to create a lot of uncertainty. And uncertainty is the only thing you don't want if you want to promote or attract investment. Point number one. But also, are you going to really invest when you don't know what is the model that is going to be based for you in the next 5 years or 10 years term? Even as a person, if I tell you tomorrow you want to buy a house and the rules for what you are planning of your house are going to potentially change in 2, 3, 5, 6, and 7 years because we do different rules every time in case there is a different government. Are you going to take the risk and to buy your house and to put your money in this, or are you going to wait and to and just to try to understand where is the best return you're going to put? So I think that's the world challenge we have in front of us. So for me, it's super important to answer because there are, we are a big tax contributor, as you can imagine, by all the operations that we have. So, but for me, the most important is this: longer term, or 2020. Let's try to work on some common principles, and we can base the principles, the neutrality. Let's not try to start thinking to one specific sector and to think that that sector is going to be the one where all the money is coming from, and etc. But also, let's start thinking to the market failure when we can intervene rapidly in order to be able to, one, give a level playing field to everybody, and two, to be able to be sure that everybody pays it. Because most of the time, we don't think to it But we may see a pirated content, or we may see a pirated service, and we think, yes, it will cost me less to use that service compared to use a legal service, right? But do you think all the things that goes with the legal service, do you think that you're paying your users, you're paying your tax, you're paying social security, and etc., compared to you're not paying anything when you're taking that part? Obviously, human behavior will try to define every time to try to pay as less as you can compared to the service that you get. So we cannot imagine that people are going to say, oh yes, I want to pay 10 times more because I'm a good man. Okay, my father educated me like this, so probably I'm one of the most stupid guys because I do that all the time. But I believe a lot in this. Okay, I'm a huge believer in a rule of law and the legality of doing other things. But there we need government intervention to be sure that they tackle the question of illegality at the same time that they tackle the question, I'm going to put a new tax. Okay? Because at the end, the basket is the same. How you fill the basket is the important thing. And if you can fill the basket by treating everybody in the same way, you have a short-term solution that gets much faster, and implementation is not so difficult. It's challenging, but it's not so difficult. You know, some countries like Chile made a very good anti-piracy legislation and are working on it. And why, you know, I didn't want to focus only on piracy, but I just wanted to give you an example because I knew that they were going to go on themes that were much more macro because it's normal. But at the same time, this is an easy example of how much money is lost. Remember, $1.4 billion. It's an easy number. Okay? How much, you know, do we have, and that's going to be my question for the panel, do we have a question of how much money we will raise, for example, in Latin America if we will create, like, I don't know, a 5% digital tax on those companies that don't pay taxes? And I would love to see if there is an answer. But let's start also to think at the contribution that those companies are doing when they go in the market and they invest and they start the business because those employees are paying the taxes. Those are jobs that were not created before. You're creating huge opportunity. You're creating huge. So let's try to balance everything because tax is every time the answer because you need to give service to your citizens. And I'm a citizen and I like getting something out of the taxes I'm paying. But at the same time, we just want to be sure that you create a competitive framework to attract those investments that are necessary to give those jobs. Remember the other numbers. So I told you 1.4 and then I shut up. 1.4 trillion, 50,000 jobs only for our sector. 50,000 jobs. It's not a small number, huh? How many taxes are coming out of those 50,000 jobs? And most of the time, those jobs are engineer jobs and etc. So they're not exactly, they're good jobs too. So think to the two. It's a regional number, obviously. I can share with you if you want the exact report that I'm referencing from Alianza. But that can give you a good idea. But this is what I want to focus on. I have many more points, but you know, a lot were already said.
Thank you very much, Karim. That was great. Well, we've heard four terrific, very well-informed presentations on a very complicated issue. And just looking at the list of participants here, I see there are a lot of people who are very involved in this debate and discussion. So I think we should just open it up. I know that Luis may have to leave us a few minutes early, right? So if you have any very hard questions, you might want to direct them to him first. So no, I'm just kidding. But if you could just please identify yourselves and direct your question. Please be brief. Yes, please. We'll start with you.
Thank you. My name is Lucia. I work for the IDB. And my question is for Grace, and it's specifically about this issue that Ubaldo and Karim raised. And it's about your view on countries taking unilateral actions. And I was reading a report that was released by the IMF a couple of weeks ago about digitalization, and they call them short-term actions. But is this a reality? I mean, we have countries, you know, like passing bills, implementing actions to, you know, like to tax these kind of services. And we're waiting for 2020, but this is moving really fast, right? And they are losing resources. So, you know, like what is your view on that? Our countries are gonna, you know, just adopt the OECD measures once they are here? And my second question has to do with information. If you have dialogue with the countries, many times they don't know how much they are losing because they don't know, like the countries that operate in the country, they don't have MOUs reporting, like the number of users, or so they cannot quantify in the moment that you as a government have to make a decision on adopting something to tax companies, like it's difficult. Are you working on something about quantification of digital economy and, like the benefits that governments can take from it? Thank you.
Why don't we take one more question? Grace can think about her answer. Yes, over here, please.
Hi, Ruben Sithvon with Amazon. Two quick questions, one for the Deputy Minister. One, could you speak a little bit about the approach that Colombia has taken at the OECD and the proposal that Colombia put forward, and kind of the thought process behind that? And then from the IDB, obviously, I think over 80 countries now have applied the VAT to digital services for companies that are not resident in those countries. The vast majority have applied the non-VAT registration model. The Argentines put forward last year the FI model, the financial intermediary model. As the IDB is engaging with countries to collect that, I wonder what is the approach that the IDB is recommending for governments and why?
Great, thank you. Why don't we start with Luis, since you may have to leave, so why don't you get that question, and then we'll go to Grace, and then we'll go to both of you.
Well, actually, the role that we are playing there is we joined the discussion, as Grace mentioned, and some other countries were, well, in some part we're discussing the economic significant presence approach, and well, there were others, in particular US and UK, that they had a different point of view, and we joined basically Argentina, India, a couple of more I don't remember, but those three basically were the one that were trying to, and we think definitely that we need a middle point between the approaches. I think all of the position that already has been promoted are like bad equilibriums, all of them. From the emerging market that have the market. I don't want to quote which companies, but if you check profits of some companies that are from the digital area and these kind of things, they have even higher profits from emerging markets because of the population than in the advanced economies. And so we need, our position is definitely we need a consolidated approach of this. And I'm going to reply, even it wasn't a question for me, but the first question to Grace. And I think it's a difficult problem. And I don't think that the output, the fiscal output that we're losing there, or the fiscal expenditure that we are having there because we are not collecting taxes there, are so much compared to or our rate of impatient can wait. I mean, why? Because actually in emerging markets, especially that have the problem that your colleague just mentioned properly, and we are losing money not only taxing digital economy. I mean, for instance, in Colombia, we know like we have some goods that are like excluded from the VAT. There are no digital economy. You have excluded many goods, among them food that actually is completely eaten by rich people, and we don't charge them with the VAT. And we know it from the Romans. I mean, before Spanish people got there, we knew that we have to put VAT. And we already know it. I mean, in the last tax reform, I was trying to convince even my wife that actually we have to charge the food. I mean, because we have to charge the food. Why? Because the rich people is the one that actually eat the food. The poor people don't eat the food, unfortunately. And that actually, when you have excluded goods, you are wasting money because you are basically excluding for the richest people. Just to mention one data, in Colombia, for every 100 pesos or $100, whatever number, 100% of excluded good that you have, 30% of the 100 that you are losing, you are not taxing, you are not collecting, actually goes directly to the 10% richest people in Colombia, just because you have excluded goods. So actually, we know that you are, I mean, when you ask the finance minister, the vice finance minister, and the people that actually take decisions and they make decisions that actually know that we are at some point we are not getting collecting money, and at least from Colombia, actually we love the cooperation work that it has been doing. And if we have to wait till 2020 to have completely clear, of course we can stop the work related to the topic, and we can stop all the process, but we would love to have a unique idea about the topic, to have some guidelines, to have some, I don't know, principles or something like that, because I think the arbitrage that you can have in this topic is huge, and probably that is going to be either greater and greater and greater in the future, in the near future. So I would love to hear what Grace thinks about it, but definitely I think it's helpful. I mean, even if we have to stop the topic and wait 2 years, but we can arrange and we can get a good point of view. I mean, when you don't end it up in a bad equilibrium that you are charging too much, or you have BEPS problems or things like that, base erosion and profit shifting. Well, for us, is the perfect word. And just to run out, because I have to leave, but it's important what Karin said in terms of the arbitrage that is in between the formal and informal sector. And that's important, and not only in the digital economy. Actually, we have in digital economy 2 arbitrage problems. The first one that is for all Latin countries, at least, and emerging markets, that actually we are charging too much the companies, and we are not charging people, and we are not charging personal income, but neither the VAT. We have many problems in the personal and in other different that are not company taxes, and we have the first arbitrage. That's why in Colombia we try to reduce the tax corporate, because we think the only way to actually get that people that can pay the higher taxes is reducing the taxes. Later you're going to have a greater base because they are able to pay it. But the second part that actually is quite common is in this discussion. You not only have the arbitrage between being formal and informal in the digital economy, but also you have an arbitrage between the developed countries and the undeveloped countries, or the emerging markets. Why? Because they have been trying since, as Karin mentioned, many years ago, try to reduce the tax corporate. They have been working in direct taxes. They have been working in many issues that led them to reduce the tax corporate. And we have a huge, a very high tax corporate, and we have a second arbitrage there. So actually, we have a problem of incentive there, and you can solve it with only one shot in Chile, another one in Argentina, another one in Colombia, another one in Jamaica, I don't know, whatever. Actually, you need a cooperated decision there and align with all these problems.
Great. Thank you, Luis Alberto. It was excellent. Grace?
Okay. Well, to answer the question about the interim measures, I want to go back in time a little bit. Karim took us back to the Roman era, the financing wars. When do you think is the first time the OECD first started discussing the issue of digitalization or e-commerce?
The Roman Empire thing.
It was a little after that, Karim. Sorry, but it was a while ago. It was in 1998 that the OECD came out with the Ottawa Framework Conditions on e-commerce, as it was known then. And at the time, having reviewed, everyone was all excited about this new type of economy. And so we looked at it, but at the end of the day, the decisions that were taken then were it's important to consider neutrality, and we really think that the current rules can still address the issue. And so after having analyzed it in 1998, we said, yeah, but let's just stick with the old rules. So then we come to the BEPS project, starts in 2013. Action number 1 is digital, and action number 1 on income tax didn't deliver because we said, let's wait till 2020. So that, I think, is a lot of the reason why you are seeing unilateral interim measures. There's been a lot of time that has passed since we first started discussing this issue, and nothing has really happened on the corporate income tax side. And that is what a lot of people were concerned about. And this is why even in the interim report that we issued last March, we recognized that countries were going to take temporary and interim measures. And what we tried to do was put some parameters around that, because the interim measures that are being taken are taken on a gross basis, so that's quite distortive and could be very detrimental to companies, especially those in a loss situation, which a lot of these innovative companies are in. And interim measures often are enacted as interim measures, but end up never disappearing from the list of taxes that you have. So there are a lot of reasons not to have interim measures, but at the same time, we in the OECD are not condemning them, because countries are feeling very frustrated that nothing has happened. So we are accelerating our work on the corporate tax side, but I want to emphasize something that I mentioned and that Ubaldo focused a bit more on. There is a lot that developing countries and Latin American countries can do in the VAT side. With the recommendations that we have come out with from the OECD, which Ubaldo described, there is a lot of revenue to be gained. And I want to quote a few statistics. We have, in terms of worldwide business to consumer transactions, the sales are estimated at 4.5 trillion by 2021, so that's right around the corner, and 1 trillion of those sales are cross-border. So there is a lot to be gained in the VAT side with the simplifications that Ubaldo mentioned, the fact that now essentially platforms will become the new banks. Why do I say that? Because what have tax administrations typically done? They have used financial institutions as a third party to facilitate payment of taxes, collection of taxes, withholding of taxes. And that is what we are going to see in this new era, is the use of these platforms as a third party in this whole exercise, which will help increase a collection. And I just want to give you a few more figures, because in addition to saying that you ought to tax where the customer's usual residence is, and suggesting that you have registration of these offshore or foreign companies in the country in which they're selling into, to simplify, we have also suggested to countries, and we just heard about the exemptions for food, but there are also exemptions in a lot of countries' tax systems, VAT systems, for low-value goods. Why is that? Because the volume wasn't that great before you had this highly digitalized business of online sales. But online sales have increased dramatically, and so these small things that all of us buy from Amazon and others, that adds up in terms of potential VAT revenue loss. And so here I'm going to give you some statistics. The EU estimates that the loss currently is 5 to 7 billion in a year from this kind of taxation that is foregone. The other thing I want to mention, I have to find the Australian figures, because they did eliminate this low-value goods exemption, and they recovered 81 million Australian dollars in the first quarter, which was 4 times more than they had budgeted for. So there is a tremendous amount of potential VAT revenue in this whole area. I'm not saying we should ignore the direct tax and the corporate income tax issue, and I spent most of my time talking about that because that's the issue currently under discussion. But there is a lot that can be done in the VAT side, and we are actually partnering with the IDB to develop a toolkit to help Latin American countries and other developing countries to implement these VAT recommendations if they want to. It's not obligatory, but we both see that there is a tremendous potential of a revenue gain through the implementation on the VAT side.
So, Michael, if you allow me one thing, because I want to use also our IDB and OECD resource with Angel, because we just stole it from the from the OECD, but he was giving me some data just to give you an idea on that VAT for Latin America, and it's a CEPAL estimate, right? That the potential revenue from VAT in digital service in Latin America is $580 million. Okay, that's a VAT potential estimate, CEPAL. Remember, I go back to my old 1.4 billion, okay, 3 times more. It doesn't mean one replace the other. It just gives you an idea of the difference. Okay.
Well, yeah, just to remark, because Grace responded to the question, the simple solution, the practical VAT implementation, the less expensive, both for the taxpayer or the platform in this case, and the revenue administration is a simple one. And if we convince all countries or most of them to come up with an easy and non-expensive solution, then we're helping develop not just commerce from outside of the region coming to Latin America, but the regional trade between partners as well, which is important. So we're partnering with the OECD and the Global Forum on VAT to come up with easy solutions.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Tell us who you are. And
Thank you. Santiago Gomez, Embassy of Colombia. This is a question, I guess, mainly for Grace, but I guess it also touches on some of the subjects that Valdo has been cooperating on with the OECD. And fundamentally, it's about the interaction between OECD and WTO regarding these new the developments of BEPS Action 1. Specifically, if there has been some coordination between the two institutions, as there has been some critics or preoccupation arising from the compliance of the new proposals of the EU to WTO standards. So I was wondering, what is that coordination, if there is, and if there are some outcomes on that respect?
thank you. Yes, back, please.
Oh, okay. Hi, thank you. I'm Rachel Carrillo. I work in the gig economy as a freelance writer from an international development background. So I have a question mainly for IADB, but please weigh in. It's a two-part question. One is you mentioned the loss of hotel revenues and workers, and I'm wondering how the platform economies currently, like in tourism and travel, like Airbnb and something called VRBO and any of the others across Latin America, how is that playing in to increasing any tax base or from what's displaced from those hotel and tourism taxes? And then just across the board, what's the role of cryptocurrencies and the blockchain ledgers in taxation and the future of everything from development funding, which is going on right now through blockchain, and how that may play out as well in increasing multilateral and bilateral cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't we go back to our panel? Baldo, you want to start?
Yeah, quickly on the Airbnb question, the person offering their place to host travelers becomes an entrepreneur for VAT purposes. The moment they do that, they're already been in a trade. Now, technically, they haven't registered. I don't think any of them has registered for VAT. So that's a VAT that's been lost. There's some way of addressing that through compliance, which is information from third party, in this case, cooperating with the platforms to receive the information about people offering and the revenue they make out of this. So there's a solution. We just need to find, first of all, friendly ways And when I say friendly ways, I refer like to apps. Like when you download the app, you as a host, it should have a platform, a link directly to the tax revenue administration and make it easier for you to comply. Even with the help of the platform, part of the income can be diverted directly to the treasury, to the national treasury, all right? But we haven't, or the countries haven't done that yet. We're talking about things that are from yesterday. That's on the books. It should be done. Blockchain, since 3-4 years, every conference, someone says blockchain is the answer to the problems of taxation. I'm not so convinced about that. There's an aspect about transactions being hidden with cryptocurrencies. They're semi-anonymous. But in terms of service, it doesn't add much, generally speaking, to the revenue agencies. There's some fields where it's been applied, like in real estate, or even identification of groups of people, but it hasn't, as of today, taken over in tax administration. That's the view.
Great. Karim, do you have anything? Any
I think,
thoughts?
I will let that answer to my colleagues of that sector. I think the biggest principle there, and I don't want to be controversial, but it's what I said before. There is a big need of modernizing the regulatory frameworks. Okay, so I think we start looking at similar services. Difficult for me to go to in hotellery because I'm not an hotel owner, or I don't do that business. But if I see at our sectors, when you look at digital and you think to where we are a telecom operator that made a lot of evolutions in the last year, and we're becoming a pure TMTA company, A being also advertising. And in some places, specifically in the region, we are still regulated in a totally different way than some of our main competitors. And the main challenge is changing the legislation and adapting the legislation to be sure that everybody is treated the same. And why it has a relevance to what you're saying is legislation imposed some regulatory fees. And regulatory fees are different. For example, unfortunately, the deputy minister is not there anymore, but one of the examples is Colombia for that. Regulatory fees are different compared to what old sector you're coming from. So if you are a so-called OTT, you pay a certain part. If you are a traditional telco content distribution, you pay another one. But at the end, we do the same. We distribute content. So the reality is that it's just the sector evolving so fast, and pieces of legislation are very complicated to evolve. Before being in DC, I was in Brussels, and I can tell you that a piece of legislation take 5-6 years in order to be presented and to be implemented. And in 5-6 years, think to it. Where were we 6 years ago in digital? It's unbelievable. I even see how I consume my content, that's the challenge for, I think, the political world, is being able to try to develop regulatory framework that potentially are future-proof without knowing what the future is. It's in my daily job, I advocate of simplification, of modernization. But we also need to understand the difficulties that it has. So I think we will have to move in process that are really adapting, believing a lot in the regulators and in how the implementation of the regulation is done, and go with a lot of principles and then adapting. But the most important thing is to try to do the market analysis as much as we can and as fast as we can, and to be sure that we update the market analysis constantly. Because the market specific in digital is changing so fast. Look, I just moved from Europe, okay? And just for an easy one, I moved 3 months ago. In Europe, we have a way to do banking and etc. that is totally different than here. It's funny. And we are so-called developed economy. I don't like that word, and my mother is from Tunisia, so we are so-called underdeveloped, or whatever they want to call us when we look at the Tunisian side. But just between economies that are very similar, we just do the things totally differently. So imagine, take that and apply it in countries like Latin America. This is our discussion today. How can we compare the legislation of Argentina to the legislation of Chile or to the legislation of Ecuador and Peru? And it's so complicated that the challenge is, for me, working a lot with international organization, believing much more in international organization, use the OECD probably as one of the bases. I'm a real believer, and try to do a lot of regional harmonization. Maybe we can learn something from the Europeans in that side. I'm not saying to do a European Union, Latin American Union, but try to harmonize at least some of the challenges like the digital, because you use digital, and it's Ruben of Amazon left, but they're an incredible example. Who is using Amazon in this room? Okay, now let's do it. Who is not using Amazon in this room? You asked that question 5 years ago, probably nobody was doing it, at least on the other side of the Atlantic. Here, I'm sure you guys were much more advanced than us. But, if you look at it today, everybody buys almost everything on Amazon. It's an example. It's a 100% rate if you're not cheating. And you didn't want to show.
Thank you, Karim. We'll give the last word to Grace.
Okay, well, I'll quickly try to answer the question about the EU measures and the WTO. As you may know, the EU measures did not go through, and so there is not going to be a directive on an interim measure, which was the concern of the potential concern of WTO. Now, having said that, a number of EU countries have gone ahead and proposed measures, but Italy, Spain, they haven't actually enacted them. The UK, theirs wouldn't kick in until 2025. So as far as I know, there hasn't been a WTO challenge to any of these unilateral measures. And we are not getting involved because we're working on the long-term measure, not these interim gross basis measures. I just wanted to comment briefly on the cryptocurrencies and blockchain. Our Forum on Tax Administration has looked at this. We've looked at it, and blockchain is a tool. It is not a panacea, and every tax administration has to look and see, is it going to give us something better than what we are already using? And so, for example, in the OECD context, we have what is called the Common Reporting Standard to exchange automatically financial account information. And so some have suggested, oh, maybe you should move from the XML approach you have to blockchain, but our tax administration say we don't see enough of an added advantage to go to that we would change this whole system. So it depends on the cryptocurrencies, virtual assets, as they're now being called by the FATF. I agree with Ubaldo that there are a lot of risks there. I'm the OECD representative to the Financial Action Task Force, and I just came from the G20 finance ministers meetings, and they're all very concerned about how virtual assets can be abused for criminal activity. So.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to thank Grace, Ubaldo, and Karim for their excellent, and Luis Alberto for their excellent remarks today. This is obviously a topic that is only going to become more salient than it is today, and it's a real challenge, I think, for all of us, not only in the private sector, the OECD, but also think tanks like the Inter-American Dialogue to really try to contribute to a productive debate, because there's a lot of issues that I think have to be addressed. And as we move forward, I hope that we could continue to collaborate and work together. So please join me in thanking our excellent speakers today.